Okay, Amrita.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 6th seminar in our IDS series on inclusive trade, where we take on questions on trade and development head-on. Today, we discuss trade policy and its role for sustainable and inclusive agriculture. Agricultural commodities account for a very significant share of exports globally. Agricultural value chains facilitate the exchange of not just products, but ideas and knowledge, including, for example, through South-South cooperation. Yet, international trade in agriculture is often linked with unsustainable methods of production, with struggles aligning with food security goals and decent farmer livelihoods, specifically with the intersecting crises that are ongoing, as well as there are negative climate and environmental impacts. There are asymmetries in coping with the various crises, and these asymmetries are in capabilities, in coping mechanisms across households, regions, and groups involved in agriculture. So clearly, nowhere are the links between sustainable and inclusive international trade more visible than in agriculture. It is critical that we try and understand how to align trade policy with agricultural reform. Today, we have with us Anna Sands, who is a senior policy advisor at WWF UK. Anna specializes in trade and works on UK's new independent trade policy and how to make it greener and more equitable. Anna will be talking about inclusive and sustainable trade and offering her thoughts through the different streams of work ongoing at WWF UK, as well as results from a joint collaboration between IDS and WWF. We are also joined by David Saddington. David is team leader on sustainable supply chains at the International Forests Unit at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and FCDO UK. We also have with us Professor Pierluigi Montalbano. Pierluigi is a professor at Sapienza, University of Rome, and is a chairholder of the Monnet Chair on Rethinking EU Trade Policy for Development. So indeed, we have quite an exciting panel today with us. If you have questions while the speakers are speaking, please post them in the chat window. But without taking any more time, I'd like to now pass over to Anna. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Amrita, and thank you so much for hosting this webinar. We've been delighted to be able to work with the Institute of Development Studies to produce this policy brief, which launches today. And my presentation will be about that policy brief, about the work that we're doing on trade. And I'm really looking forward to also hearing the comments from David and Pierluigi after the presentation and to the audience's questions. So let me start by saying that we have a broken food system, which needs fixing desperately. And we've seen this very much recently with the Ukraine crisis and how it's shown how vulnerable our system is to shocks and how easy it is to destabilize and to create food shortages around the world, price increases. And we know this is nothing new because we've had problems with access to food across the world well before these crises. And it's just exacerbated the existing problems. So we know that 800 million people go chronically hungry, and over half of these people are small-scale farmers and their families, which is a massive paradox if these are the people who are producing food, who don't get the nutrition that they need. And apart from the social impacts, we know that the food system is also the biggest driver of nature loss. It contributes 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions, and it's very linked with the fossil fuel production system, which is why we see such huge food price rises when we have oil price rises because of the way the fertilizer is produced, meaning that oil price rises increase fertilizer prices, increase food prices overall. So we know that we need to change the system, and we know that we need to do this in a global way because of how interconnected our food system is and how much trade is important in this. So we can't do this just as one country, especially in the UK, where we import almost half of our food. Thinking about food policy needs to involve thinking about how we do trade in food. And we need desperately to create a system where trade supports us in reaching an agriculture that allows us and nature to thrive. And this is what our policy brief is about. It's about how do we use that trade aspect to lead us to a food system that we need. So some of you might have heard about agroecology. This is an idea that you can farm together with nature using the nature's ecosystem rather than having to use a lot of artificial inputs to sort of drive that system. Now there's a lot of things you can do to improve how you work with nature in farming. It's not necessarily about not using any artificial inputs, but it's about using as much as possible the ecosystem and understanding how to work with it. So for example, it involves maintaining soil health and ensuring that the soil can regenerate itself. And something that happens when we use fertilizer is that the more fertilizer we use, the more fertilizer we need to use, and so on, because there are diminishing returns from its use. And that's not only inefficient, it also degrades the quality of the soil and means that in the future it's even harder to grow things. So we know how that is also linked to deforestation and conversion, because farmers then need to go and look elsewhere for soil that is capable of producing things. So we know that one of the things one can do to maintain that soil health and to improve farming is to do intercropping, so to use more different types of crops on one piece of land. Now, the way I think about this is that if we were to invest all of our money into one thing, that would be terribly risky, and all financial advisors would say it's a bad idea. And yet in the farming system, we have 4 or 5 main crops, which we use to feed most of our population and to feed the animals that we then eat. And it's not only very risky from an environmental point of view, because what happens if there's a pest that kills one of these types of crops? For farmers, it's also very risky financially. So bringing in more crops into their production not only means they're better environmentally, but also provides them more financial resilience. And another aspect that's important for agroecology is diminishing waste. So this is about reusing products, reusing the residue of crops, reusing animal manure, putting it back into the system, and that way creating more of a cycle that's more in line with how nature would work for this. And the good news is you don't have to choose between nature and people. So like I was explaining, intercropping has better results for farmers as well as better results for the environment. Through reducing fertilizer use, we're also cutting input costs for farmers. And that's particularly important when fertilizer prices are so linked to global economic events and global geopolitical events. We also know that agroecological farms are more resilient to climate impacts and to different extreme events that will happen more and more frequently with climate change. So we've seen studies where Hurricane Mitch in Central America had an impact on farms, which was much worse for conventional farms than it was for agroecological farms. We also know that agroecology has health benefits for farmers. And there's a really nice example from Minas Gerais in Brazil, where there were farmers working on cotton. And so this is a very traditional thing to do in that particular region. But farmers were starting to struggle to make things out of cotton because of the amount of pesticides that were used. So they were getting allergic reactions and they couldn't weave the cotton. But introducing agroecological practices meant they could go back to that weaving process. But also it tripled the cotton productivity over 2 years. And it also increased production of other crops that were being used on the same land. So it had many beneficial effects across both the financial and the health aspects. Now, so you might be asking the question, like, why aren't we there yet? Like, why is it's such a great system? Why are we not there? How is that possible if it's also beneficial for economics and farmers? Well, we definitely need systemic change to get there. There will be lots of different things that we need to do, but one of them is we need to think about how we finance farming and how we use subsidies for farming. So after the Second World War, there was a lot of push into producing more. The so-called Green Revolution meant that there was a huge increase in farm productivity, but through the use of synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, and there was a lot of incentivizing farmers to produce as much as they could from their land. So the money was going to pay for production. And this is now very unhelpful because it's maintaining that level of production artificially through creating these sort of higher prices through state subsidies without incentivizing the transition that we need. So we know that currently out of the $720 billion that are annually used for agricultural support, 40% of that is maintaining prices artificially above international levels. So this needs to change, and we know that there are countries that are trying to do that. And the UK is on a pathway to reforming its subsidy system by introducing the new environmental land management scheme, which includes a sustainable finance incentive. So this is the idea that we could be directing more of the payments for farmers towards environmental services and towards farmers who are doing more for the environmental good that they can produce of their farm, like restoring wildlife or maintaining ecological services. And this is all being developed at the moment, so very much a work in progress, which a lot of NGOs like WWF are working on as well. But this could be a world-leading system if we do it right, because it could mean that we're actually paying for the environmental externalities of farming rather than just for maintaining certain levels of production, whatever the cost. And so we know that this needs to happen in many countries, but we also know that there are other things that need to support that. And in the case of the UK, it's especially important that we think about how trade impacts it, because we are also in the process of opening our markets through free trade agreements. Having left the EU, we have that capacity to now have independent trade relationships. And we know that through doing that, we might be putting our own production in competition with what we import from abroad. And unfortunately, we're already fueling environmental destruction through the way that we consume, through the products that we're asking to be brought here so we can consume them. And it's incredibly important for us to think about it because we import almost half of our food. So this is a very big chunk of our market. And I know that some would make the argument that it's a question of sovereignty, that countries can produce in the way that they want because it's their natural resources, so they can use them as they want. But what I'd like to raise here is that it's not about telling countries how they should produce, but it's about saying, what do we want to consume and what do we want to incentivize? So I think we need to acknowledge the power of export markets and the power of what we incentivize through the markets that we create. So we can't dissociate ourselves from the effects of that production if we're entrenching a certain type of harmful consumption. And as a positive example, we've heard that there was a ban on pesticides in Punjab in India, 10 types of pesticides on basmati rice, because they wanted to export more to markets where these weren't meeting food safety requirements. And that was also improved the health and the environment of that particular area. So we know that export markets do drive the regulations and the ways that things are done. So we must take that responsibility. And the way that we are suggesting we should do that is by introducing minimum environmental standards for what we import. So we don't currently have any environmental standards that are mandatory for what we import. we only have that for food safety, for what could affect us in the product, but we don't say what is the type of production that we are willing to accept. And we could do this by creating legislation that sets out this minimum baseline that's comparable to what we require of our own farmers. So it would be like saying that we need to create a level playing field across what we do domestically, what we do internationally. Now, this would support our domestic reform. Like I was saying, it would support farmers in shifting to that system where they are geared towards environmental services rather than producing with a cost to nature. But it would also make sure that we are not incentivizing these types of unhelpful markets abroad. And in an ideal world, it helps us to move not just us, but other markets towards a farming system that's more like the ecological system that I was describing, which has beneficial effects both for farmers and for nature. And we could do this via setting out legislation like we have for food safety. So things that apply across trade deals that are equally applied to different countries, so that we don't have to, so that we make sure that they're fair, they're not different for every country we trade with. And we have existing examples of how that could work. The US has a Marine Mammals Protection Act, which requires that all the fisheries that export to the US have to meet a minimum level of effectiveness in protecting marine mammals. So this is things like ensuring that there isn't bycatch of dolphins in fishing, or that they're not being culled in the process of farming salmon. And this has passed various WTO tests, and we can see that it has an impact on how importers are working, how they're choosing the fisheries they collaborate with, and in fact, the way that those fisheries work. But to finish, I'd like to say that we need to also support farmers to meet these new standards through this transition. So it can't just happen overnight. It's not something that we would require them to meet, from one day to the next. We have to support farmers domestically, but we also have to do that internationally. And part of this is about how we design the standards, how we make sure that the implementation periods are correct, but it's also about how we support that process. So we know that for a lot of farmers, it won't necessarily be the case of they don't meet these standards. Quite often they will, because smallholder farmers in developing countries won't be using as much of some of these products, like harmful pesticides, or they might already be farming quite well, but they might need more support to prove that they're doing that and to meet those kind of compliance requirements and for the infrastructure to be created. So we need to make sure that that exists. And there's a few existing initiatives that we could build on, and there's surely more that could be created. But just as an example, at the international level, there's a standards and trade development facility. This is a sort of multi-stakeholder facility that's based around the WTO, which is about strengthening capacity to meet food safety, animal and plant health requirements in developing countries. And this could be expanded to include environmental standards. For example, they would support shrimp farmers in Bangladesh to meet food safety requirements for European market, for example, and then help them to improve their practices so they got that additional market access. There is the Aid for Trade initiative, which is more about supporting the development of trade in developing countries, to support sort of getting rid of trade-related constraints. Now, this currently doesn't fund a huge amount of environmental projects, but it could be geared towards that. It could be used in that way. We, of course, have our own overseas development assistance, which could be geared towards farming projects. And there's private finance, which I think could also have a massive influence if the loans provided to farmers were based on better conditions. For example, there could be a very low interest or no interest loans for the transition to better farming practices. It's definitely something that could help enormously. And I think that we can learn a lot from deforestation and conversion work that's already ongoing, because there's so much already being done to work with smallholders in that space to support them in meeting new requirements. So that's one of the reasons why I'm very glad that we have David Saddington with us today. So I'm very interested as well to hear about how it can be done from the perspective of the work on deforestation, the fact dialogues, and what we can learn from that. So thank you very much again for creating the space, and I'll pass on, I guess, to Amrita or to David.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Anna, for talking through really important practicalities around trade policy and agricultural policy, and what are the possibilities to create some alignments, including where support is critical, for gaps, finance gaps, with excellent examples, I think, from all over the world. I would now like to invite David. David, over to you, and then Pierluigi. Yes.
Thanks, Amrita, and thanks so much, Anna, for that really thought-provoking presentation. And I think just as I sort of start, what I wanted to talk about, maybe just coming back to some of the important things which you started on, the fact that, the agricultural system, as you said, is broken at the moment. I know that is a feeling which we have certainly heard a lot. For those who were at COP27, I thought this was a really interesting narrative which came out so strongly in the Food Pavilion, in the presidency, in many, many initiatives. And it's really good to see that the sector is getting the attention it deserves. And what I want to talk around is what we did for COP26, the fact dialogue, which has just been mentioned there, the forest, agriculture and commodity trade dialogue. And this was set up, I'll say a little bit more in a minute, but it was very much set up because of some of the statistics. Again, Anna was pointing out, a third of emissions come from our global food system, but around half of that comes directly from deforestation. So conversion of tropical forests, of carbon-rich ecosystems around the world, and all of that is driven, the production and the global trade of the commodities which are driving that deforestation is broadly because we in consumer countries are demanding products such as palm oil, soy, cattle, beef, chocolate, for example. So, this element of trade, when we talk around reforming food systems, reforming agriculture, nature loss, is absolutely integral. We need to have both sides of that trade conversation working together, the farmers on the ground who are producing and exporting these commodities, but also the businesses, the consumers at the other end of the supply chain where the products are coming to. So within this framing, when we had the COP26 presidency, we set out to really think around how could we accelerate this transition, particularly focused on deforestation and the global trade in those commodities, which I've mentioned, and really that question of, how do we move from a system which is, detrimental to the environment to one which is sustainable, regenerative, and supports smallholders in that transition. And that's where we came to in establishing the forest, agriculture, and commodity trade dialogue. Those who aren't familiar with this work, we set it up in our COP presidency work. It is a dialogue which we set up and we co-chair still to this day with Indonesia. It involves the 28 largest importers and exporters of tropical risk commodities. So commodities such as palm oil, soy, beef, chocolate, timber, for example. And what we felt that back in 2020, when we were devising this, that there was a real gap in international architecture to bring together the importers and the exporters of those commodities. So, the G7 member countries, but also, the emerging markets like China, for example, with the major producers of commodities like Indonesia, Brazil, Ghana. So we established the facts dialogue, and at COP26 in Glasgow, we got these countries to agree a roadmap for action, which covers 4 areas, which I think resonates very well, Anna, with what you were saying, that the 4 areas which we have within FACT is trade and markets, supporting smallholders, transparency and traceability, and research, development and innovation. And in each of these pillars of the roadmap, the countries are now working to progress that vision, which is set out in Glasgow at COP27 a few months ago. We presented a progress report, and we continue to work with both countries to deliver that vision. But I think the 2 which are particularly relevant to the conversation, which Anna's started here, is first of all standards as it relates to trade, and the second one around supporting smallholders. So I'll sort of dwell on that a little bit more. In the FACT dialogue, we within those 28 member countries, we actually have covered 75% of the global trade of those commodities. And the reason that we sort of have that group of, relatively small group of countries goes back to our theory of change, I guess, which we had in our COP presidency, of how can we move faster with the right group of people, whether that's country leaders, whether that's business leaders, but how can you sort of move into a real leadership position in transforming some of these sectors. And we've seen some really good work in the coal sector, for example, moving from coal to clean in the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And we wanted to have this similar group of countries within the FACT dialogue. And the FACT dialogue really does get to the heart of some of those standards issues. A trade and markets group, we're asking ourselves a question, what does sustainable trade mean? I think that's a really important question to ask, and it is one where we do need the views from the producers and the consumers, because of course sustainable means different things to different people. There is no universal definition of this at the moment, and what we are seeing is actually fragmentation in markets as people define what they see as sustainable. But of course, going back to the smallholder on the ground, it's very unhelpful to have a plethora of standards which you need to meet and do different things for. That is a very unreasonable burden, which I think we give to farmers in Indonesia, for example. So really trying to think, more collectively around how can we have more synergy between, countries and companies on what we're asking for when we talk around sustainability. And of course, flowing from that, the questions of proving it. So, what are the synergies in transparency and traceability metrics? And we certainly see this at the moment in the due diligence legislation, which is coming from the UK, but also the European Commission. And, shortly we expect to see similar measures from the US. And for those who aren't familiar with that work, the due diligence obligation on forest risk commodities will, in the UK, make it mandatory for businesses of a certain size to ensure that they are complying with the national law of the forest countries, to make sure that the commodities they are bringing into the UK, importing into the UK, are produced in line with the national standards in those countries. So really clamping down on illegal deforestation, which is such a driver of forest loss in many of the geographies we're talking about. But on that second point, and that interplay, I think, between standards and, I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit more in questions if people are sort of interested, but I was really fascinated at COP27 around sort of how bold the World Trade Organization are on this agenda Now we have engaged the World Trade Organization within the FACT dialogue, but the Director General was speaking at COP very passionately around the role the trade sector has in mitigating climate change. And of course, this sector is, is very much in scope there. But moving on to that second point, Anna, which you talked around supporting smallholders, I think this is absolutely critical, and having that balance between, raising the bar, because of course, if you do raise the bar, you can leave people behind. And we must make sure that this transition to a sustainable food system is just and fair, very similar synergies to what we're talking around the energy transition and the just transition there, having that transformation of the sector in a way which is very inclusive, talking around smallholders and making sure their voices are represented. And of course, when we talk around forests and agriculture in many of these communities, we also, need to include the voices of Indigenous people and local communities, as well as, the more traditional view of smallholder farmers. But it also isn't an issue of, sustainable development. It is also something we must consider from a mitigation point of view, in terms of, purely sort of climate mitigation point of view. Would be very unwise to think around sort of, excluding smallholders from this conversation, even if you were just focused on sort of carbon mitigation alone. And the reason I would point to there is leakage, because what we would have if, we do have a fragmented market, if we do have segregation of standards, if we have, very high standards over there, but still very low standards over there, what we will see is that certain geographies would probably pay more for sustainable commodities being brought into the country, but globally we wouldn't come close to tackling the issue which is at heart of us here, tackling that problem of deforestation, tackling that problem of very high emissions from the sector, because other markets, China, for example, the domestic market in some of these countries would just absorb that capacity. So we must make sure, which is the real sort of theory of change there in the FACT dialogue, that we do move together on this, which I think is so crucial. But yeah, the point around smallholders is so critical. In the FACT dialogue, we have a study which will be published within a few months' time, looking at some really interesting case studies in the commodities I've mentioned. These commodities, are vastly reliant on smallholders. Around 40% of Indonesian and Malaysian palm oil is smallholders. That percentage is far higher in West Africa when it comes to cocoa. 1.6 billion people directly involved in agriculture around the world, and of course these are some of the most climate vulnerable as well. And this is why, outside of the FACT dialogue, the UK has a very long history of supporting smallholders in this transition, from partnerships of forests, mobilising finance of forests, and RED Plus programme work we do. But of course we recognise more is needed, which is why in Glasgow, when we committed that 1.5 billion to the nature work, a lot of that is around supporting smallholders in this transition. Partnerships Forest, which I mentioned, we've committed another 500 million there in Glasgow over the next 10 years to support that transition to sustainable practices. And I'm, more than happy to sort of go into more detail, but really interested in getting to some questions, and of course hearing what Professor Pierluigi has to say. But I'd just like to sort of put that out there as one example around the UK really taking a lead there in addressing our overseas footprint. But yeah, thanks so much, Anna, again for your thoughts, and it's always fantastic to see this conversation getting the attention it deserves. Thanks, Amrita.
Thanks, David. It's really great to hear the highlight on really what sustainable trade means, but also the different perspectives on sustainable trade and sort of engaging with standards. It is important to sort of consider front and center these differences and heterogeneities and ability to comply. And I think those examples were really interesting. There are lots of questions, but I'll hold on to them for a second and pass over to Professor Pierluigi. Pierluigi, over to you.
Thanks, Amrita, and thank you all for the invitation. I'll try to start the flow of the argument, my flow of the argument around what, in my opinion, is in a nutshell, the key policy recommendation here. So we are assuming that it's critical to align trade policy with agricultural reform, and the important thing is to set a sort of a minimum environmental requirements for imports. And this looks to me very similar to the CBAM initiative. It is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism introduced by the EU. And in some way, we are advocating of extending it to the agro-food sector, which is not included in the original CBAM. The idea is, in this way, to reduce the risk of carbon leakage, to get additional emissions in third countries as a result of more stringent policies in the most ambitious ones. In the case of CBAM, the EU; in your proposal, the UK. And this could be exactly the case when imports are sourced from agri-food systems that are not sustainable. This mechanism would ensure that the price of imports would reflect more accurately the carbon content, and this would comply with the international multilateral rules, other international obligations. Although this policy recommendation looks in principle reasonable also to me, I would like to stress some technical issues that, in my opinion, would hamper a full compliance to these from the main shareholders. I would start my flow of the argument at aggregate level, and then maybe, if I have time, I would like to say something on the role of smallholder farmers as well. At the aggregate level, apart from the standard issue that of setting carbon price differences at the border has undeniable welfare impacts, posing in practice additional barriers to trade, even if for a good reason in this case. And apart from the likely opposition domestic exporters that will no longer be protected from competitiveness losses on third markets, because the export will be likely replaced by possible dirtier competitors' exports in the absence of export rebates. And also, considering the European producers, downstream sectors that use carbon-intensive products as inputs will pay the higher price, because regardless of whether those inputs are sourced in the domestic country or overseas, there is, I think, a number of technical issues to take into account. First of all, how to compute an implicit unique carbon price at the border coming from heterogeneous policies at the origin. An exporter country overseas may well claim that it will reach the same goal with different instruments. So we need a common metrics to apply concretely this kind of reasonable mechanism. Another issue is that the charging third country competitors on the basis of their own emissions, as you already stressed, will penalize countries in developing world with limited resources to combat climate change. And this calls for a sort of new special differential treatment at the multilateral level. Indeed, also the Paris Agreement has started a comparative approach. David mentioned some progress made at the international level to get some differentiated policy by income level. But these international differences in carbon prices would imply carbon leakage at the expense of the most ambitious countries, a sort of re-edition of the well-known tragedy of the commons in absence of a full coordination at international level, which is currently still not in place. The second main issue is that notwithstanding the call for flexibility, high import standards could become easily non-tariff barriers for the most vulnerable developing partner countries. Indeed, the policy recommendation here is supporting for agricultural producers in the global south to meet these environmental standards. And this is in principle absolutely fine, although in practice it requires a set of relevant and heterogeneous actions to be implemented. For instance, FAO is promoting voluntary sustainability certification schemes that match well with the growing demand for sustainable certified products in the global north. They have the potential to add positive environmental and social outcomes to the economic benefits brought by trade. However, FAO itself certifies that participation rates are still low, requirements can be stringent, and compliance costs are high. So these are difficult issues to realize, to carry out in practice. And I think that a subtle issue in all these discussions is indeed the role of trade policy to, as an instrument to enhance the food security of partner countries. In this respect, before advocating general trade reforms, I think it is important to acknowledge a work that I, with other co-authors, carried out and it's been published in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. We carried out a sort of global impact assessment, investigating using the generalized propensity score matching, the impact that agricultural disincentives had on the food security for a wide sample of countries, mostly developing countries, over the long time period from 1990 to 2010, by using the Anderson nominal rates of protection as a trade policy tool that ensure comparability over space and time. These estimates show that countries providing moderate support tend to do better on most of the food security dimension in terms of food availability, but both also in terms of access and utilization. Whereas large support leads to the poorest performance. So in a nutshell, what we advocate in this work is that trade policy is important, is key, but the key policy implication is, please do not provide too much of a good thing. Too much support for producers comes at the cost of aggregate food security performance, which might even counterbalance the initial benefits or be more damaging than taxation. Furthermore, more generally, another main conclusion confirmed by other empirical investigations in this field is that since the relationship is complex, there aren't one-size-fits-all solutions. So we should really understand what kind of trade policy reforms are advocating for. It depends from different partners, different commodities. The last point is that, however, in my opinion, a general call for changing trade policy is important, but should be indeed more related to the increasing process of vertical fragmentation of agricultural production. FAO estimates that 1/3 of all agri-food exports are traded within global value chains that encompass at least 3 countries. This is a new thing, and if it is the case, we should rethink our trade policy strategies. It is sufficient to analyze very straightforward a few points in a straightforward way. First of all, if we are talking about vertical fragmentation of production, countries are no longer the relevant framework for trade analysis, but multinational firms are. Even industries are no longer the relevant economic framework. But what is important in terms of comparative advantages is the differences in tasks and business functions. Even factory endowments are no longer the relevant economic assets, but it's important to be part of global networks of exchanges of capital, knowledge, technologies, standards, and value-added services. And barriers at the border are no longer the relevant tool for trade policy, because as you mentioned, borderless regulations standards are the key instruments in this different setting. So I think that this forces us to rethink the whole trade policy conceptualization, moving from countries, industries, and gross exports to value-added exports. This implies, on the one hand, to revise domestic trade policy, softening barriers to imports, because I need access to world-class inputs. And on the other hand, to implement more selective industrial policies, fostering firms' ability to effectively exploit the learning by supplying opportunities, improving local firms' compliance with international quality, legal, labor, health, safety, environmental standards. Moreover, another work that we carried out in the GVC framework, even the level of tariff faced by countries is not only hampering their capacity to exchange goods for final consumption, but also their backward and forward GVC participation. I don't want to take too much time. Let me just to stress that there are a number of additional investigations on the role of smallholder farmers in all these. In general, empirical investigations using household surveys confirm that smallholder farmers embedded in the chains are better off than the smallholder farmers that are outside the chain, that are more marginalized. But it's true that even within the chains, smallholder farmers are the most exposed, not only to climate change in general, but to the trade policy reforms. They are most vulnerable, also less resilient. So we need to look at the trade policy by addressing the needs of the most vulnerable producers. And I think in this sense, there is a general call for complementary policies. We need to, together to the trade reforms, we should think about social protection measures, ensure that small-scale actors can meet the requirements of international markets and be able to comply with those standards. On the other hand, policies need to support not only climate change mitigation, but also adaptation by, for instance, promoting a more appropriate trade policy that could ensure that trade takes place by lowering emissions, but at the same time, keeping economic efficiency and the wealth for the smallholder farmers, which is not an easy task indeed. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to reply for questions.
Thank you so much, Pierluigi, for highlighting, why and how we can sort of rethink trade policy specifically for agriculture, and really, all the micro level evidence that is important in thinking about not just mitigation, but adaptation strategies. So I think that's really great. We do have quite a lot of questions. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to summarize the questions into 3 areas and then invite comments from all 3 of you as you'd like to take them. So the first question is quite, I think, a straightforward one, but not easy to answer. So despite recommendations to the UK government to create a set of core environmental standards, why is it that it hasn't gone ahead? What are the barriers? Of course, high standards themselves are seen as barriers, specifically for producers in other countries. And I think Pierluigi interestingly talked about this sort of evidence which suggests that it's actually moderate support, which might be the most effective. Related to that, what is and how can co-creation of sort of these minimum standards sort of go forward? That's the first question, my summary. The second question, increasing trade exacerbates environmental challenges. There's lots of evidence on this. There's associated sort of land use and climate change effects, but there's a lot of heterogeneity. There's no sort of one size fits all approach. David highlighted that we need to have approaches where no one is left behind, but how do we do this systematically? To what extent there can be these special and differentiated policies? What's really practical given the existing scenario? And the third question, perspectives of producer countries about compliance is critical. There are recent examples of huge backlash against the imposition of high standards. And of course, our policy brief, Anna, talks about the role of finance. But there are also lots of, gaps and so the associated heterogeneity in in meeting those standards. So how do we sort of, systematically go forward? If any of you would like to take any of these questions first, please go ahead. We have only 10 minutes, so short responses, please. Yes, Anna, please.
I can try and tackle the first question maybe, and then pass on. So why hasn't it happened yet? So we've definitely seen more growing interest in this topic, and we've had lots of really good conversations with both people in government and in industry about it. And I think there's a sort of shifting narrative at the moment around trade and how we should regulate trade for the environment. So especially with the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, being discussed at the EU. And for those who are not kind of in trade policy every day, this is about how you would regulate the amount of sort of carbon emissions in products that are being imported and put a sort of higher customs charge on products that have more carbon emissions in their production. So that's something that's happening at the EU at this stage, and we're hearing a lot of discussion around it in the UK as well. So I think that's kind of shifting the narrative towards debating these aspects of regulation of imports more. But maybe it's also useful for me to flag that in our proposal, we're talking about something broader than carbon. So we don't see the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism as workable for agriculture because of how there are very different types of environmental impacts in agriculture that are not all carbon related. And in fact, looking just at carbon could have some perverse outcomes, because it could mean that, for example, we don't highlight the other environmental impacts. So just to sort of put that out there. But yeah, in conclusion, it would just to say that this is not going to go away as a question. So I think we can see there will be change in the space, and we just need to try and influence it in the right direction.
Thank you, Anna. David.
Thanks, Amrita. Yeah, maybe just building on that one, on the first question, and I'll say something about the third one. I think the first one, I'd say it's challenging. I'd say it is starting to happen. The fact that we are having this conversation, the very sort of, setting up of the fact dialogue, which I mentioned, bringing the trade angle into the climate space is, relatively new. I've been working on, climate policy, international climate policy for many years, and I think you sort of now the relatively universal acceptance that trade is a really sort of, lever here, which needs to be utilized, all the way from the World Trade Organization all the way to many of the countries we've been talking about on the call, to NGOs, to businesses. I think is a real step forward. And Anna said, this is a real evolving space. And of course, in the UK as well, we're having some of those post-Brexit conversations around ELMS, for example. So I think there's a really, really exciting space. And I think sort of, the fact that trade now is so prominent in the climate discussions and the COPs is absolutely critical. And on the third question around the pushback on high standards, I actually feel there's a pushback on differentiated standards more because of that burden on smallholders, and particularly, what is the appropriate support in meeting those standards. It is that balance between sort of, knowing sort of, exactly which square meter of the grounds of your commodity came from, and that really, really high sustainability criteria versus, having a larger sort of area of focus and maybe sort of not as high sustainability. It is a balance, but I think, context matters, and that's something, Professor Pierluigi said as well in relation to these commodities. I think, we can't lose sight out of that. Absolutely, we can move together and we can think around, some of these common principles, which is what we're trying to work through on fact. But, at the end of the day, the context of these commodities really, really does matters, so we can't lose sight of that. And the final thing I'll say, just on relation to finance and smallholders, I think it's absolutely critical as well. I think we do also need to be very mindful around living income and the fact that you know, many of these globally traded commodities actually sort of don't provide that at the moment. They don't provide stability either. I mean, you know, the Russian aggression in Ukraine has been mentioned an awful lot in the chat I see, but you know, what we've seen with the commodity prices fluctuate so high and then drop so low in things like palm oil and soy and wheat and maize, it's a very uncertain market. And actually, you know, at a farm level, when we're talking around tackling deforestation, when we're talking on better land management, I think we should be also thinking around, you know, carbon as well, you know, the payment for ecosystem services, you know, carbon markets at the farm level. How do you encourage the farmer and make it profitable? How do you incentivize not only sustainable production of food and commodities, but also actually that carbon benefit as well, and all the, you know, the water management, the biodiversity, ecosystem management. So I think this needs to be a much more holistic conversation as well.
Thank you so much, David. Pierluigi, final
Yes.
thoughts from you.
I would like just to provide a sort of concrete example of actions that could be useful to work in practice towards the right direction. In my opinion, the role of DAGs, DAGs are the domestic advisory groups that are put in place in the framework of the new generation EU free trade agreements. These new generation EU free trade agreements include a standardized chapter, which is called the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, where they talk about the role of minimum standards that are required to carry out the agreement. And a sort of good practice is that of creating these domestic advisory groups that meet regularly and try to smooth the differences in rules of law and activities and practices in the different countries, and produce a sort of tailor-made provisions that could help both partners to reach a common ground in terms of environmental labor standards. And these DAGs are composed by different stakeholders. There are academic people like me, but also members of associations of small firms, NGOs, and trade unions. And of course, everything could be carried out in a better way, but I think that it is a good strategy to pursue, and I think it could be also useful to think about how to reform these DAGs also for the UK and for the goal of reaching a different trade policy.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think today's seminar, we've highlighted very important issues, but also action and cooperation. I think to implement standards in a fair way, including support for producers, support for addressing gaps, particularly, I think, in the Global South, but also, addressing more directly heterogeneities globally. So thank you, everyone. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, David. And thanks, Pierluigi, for joining us, and for the wonderful audience who posted such interesting questions. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.